Hello, students. Again, this is Professor Barrett. I want to talk to you about U.S. intelligence in the era of President Gerald Ford. He took office in August of 1974. He did not win the 1976 election. He lost it to Jimmy Carter, so Ford left office in January of 77. Strangely enough, the Ford era is absolutely one of the most important eras in the history of US intelligence, not particularly because of things that Ford did, but because of things that others did. So, for example, a new trend emerged in the early to mid 70s of at least a few people who had worked for the CIA wrote memoirs or published diaries. Sometimes they published them abroad to evade legal problems. In any case, books came into print by people who had worked at CIA, and they talked about things they and the agency had done, like overthrowing foreign governments. Um, and at the end of 1974, in December, the New York Times published a six-part article based on the so-called family jewels. Um, the family jewels, that was a list, a long document list that was created by CIA itself. What had happened was a previous DCI named Schlesinger, who was only in office for some months, had heard rumors, stories when he came to CIA that the agency had done improper or illegal things in prior years and decades. So Schlesinger sent around a memo to everyone who worked at CIA, and it said, if you know of anything improper or illegal, or if you've just heard of such things, put it in writing. Tell me about it. Put it in writing. That was done, and those stories that he received were looked into, and ultimately the agency leadership created this hyper secret document that came to be known as the family jewels. Well, someone leaked the story about the family jewels and what was in them to the New York Times reporter. So things like assassination plots um, against people like Castro and the leader of South Vietnam, who was our ally, a man named Diem, Diem. I talked about him in a prior lecture, and others. Uh, Drug testing of human beings who didn't know they were being used as guinea pigs, so LSD testing. NSA and CIA monitoring political dissidents, NSA and some others opening the mail of, NSA listening to people and their communications, and then CIA and FBI opening the mail of US citizens. A lot of things that are not great. And there it was in the New York Times. So Congress became restive. It actually passed an amendment to an existing law. It was called the Hughes-Ryan, named for two members of Congress, Hughes and Ryan. Hughes-Ryan Amendment of 1974, which for the first time ever required a president to authorize any covert actions that would be done. So before CIA could do any significant covert action, it had to be authorized by a president in writing. Furthermore, the law required that the president or one of his representatives at CIA report such covert actions promptly to relevant congressional committees. This was a huge change. And along the way, Schlesinger was out, Colby was in. William Colby had been a career intelligence officer. He had worked heroically supporting the French resistance against the Nazis in World War II, and then he worked in CIA. He worked in a number of hotspots, including Italy, where there was significant covert action against communist parties, and South Vietnam and other places. Um, The Senate appointed a committee headed by Senator Frank Church. The House also appointed its own special investigating committee. The Church Committee was more productive and successful. Those senators, headed by Senator Frank Church, had a large staff. One of the staffers was Locke Johnson, a young man who, as you know, authored our textbook, our brief textbook that we read. So Church Committee worked for about a year or so, issued about 10 volumes of reports on things that CIA and other agencies had done over the prior decades. The thing about Colby, though, is he decided that he had a constitutional and other sort of legal obligations to cooperate as he deemed appropriate with the congressional investigators. So he was way more forthcoming with the Church Committee and the other committee done by the House in providing information. This really frustrated and ultimately angered President Ford and his assistant, Henry Kissinger. They decided that Colby should go. Someday, take a look at the memoir that William Colby wrote. Early in the book, he describes how he was telephoned on a Saturday. He was not in Washington. He was asked to come home and meet with President Ford Sunday morning. He showed up. He was escorted to the Oval Office where he sat alone for a moment. Then President Ford came in. He did not shake hands. He was not warm. They sat down together. Ford said, "I've decided to reorganize my administration." And as Colby writes, he thought, uh-oh. And he writes, "At that moment, I knew I was being fired." Within some weeks, Colby got together again with President Ford and the new DCI designate, George H.W. Bush. And I'll talk about Bush further in a moment. Some other things that happened. So the Church Committee issued these reports. There was just a firestorm of controversy and lots of information revealed about the recent histories of CIA and other agencies. It was a whole new ballgame. Congress was realizing that the old oversight system, which was limited and informal, the thing that you read about in the book, The CIA and Congress, would no longer do. So in 1976, the Senate created its own full committee on intelligence with a significant staff. The House would create a similar intelligence committee the following year. So Colby is very important in CIA history. As for Ford, well, he picked George H.W. Bush to become the new director of Central Intelligence. Bush had held many jobs. He had worked as a diplomat. He had headed the Republican Party. He'd been in a number of positions. He had once been a member of the House. He didn't really have what you would call direct experience in intelligence. Nonetheless, Bush, although he was only DCI for about a year, first of all, he came to, of course, really get to know the agency and genuinely respect it. And he loved the job. He was very engaged with what the agency was doing. He quickly became well-liked by most people who worked there. When Ford lost the presidential election, most people assumed that Bush would be out as DCI. Bush sent word to President-elect Carter expressing his willingness, and obviously he would have been happy, to stay on as DCI. He made a pledge: if you continue me as Director of Central Intelligence, I will make a firm pledge to you that I am out of politics forever. President-elect Carter declined that offer. So that's the Ford era. It's only about 2.5 years, but it was a period of tremendous controversy in the press and Congress, among the public. Lots of revelations of what US intelligence had been doing. Some people still believe that the US intelligence effort was harmed by all this publicity. I'm not at all sure that that is true, but some people think so. And the era, though brief, was therefore of very substantial importance.